I'm a child survivor of the Holocaust. I was about 2 years old when the war began, and I went into hiding. My family members were picked up in the streets of Paris in the very same way that ICE people are deputizing local police and picking them up in the streets.
We're going to talk about an amazing person Brad and I were blessed to meet, named René Lichtman. He's one of the characters who we interviewed for this documentary we're working on Holocaust survivors speaking out against the genocide in Gaza. And he was born on December 4th, 1937, and he passed away on January 28th, 2025. So last week was the 1-year anniversary of his passing. But I realized that a perfect way to honor his memory would actually be to pass him the mic, because he was speaking out against ICE and against Israel before it was cool to do so. So I thought it'd be interesting to contrast some of the people who are really upset about the comparisons between ICE and Nazis, or the comparisons between Israel and Nazis, who have never faced any real anti-Semitism. Somehow these people are offended by this comparison, while René Lichtman, who himself was a Holocaust survivor, who lost most of his family members to the Holocaust, somehow he's able to see that. So let's take a listen to some of these people who I would argue they violate the principle of never again. And to do that, let's start off with Governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro.
I want to ask you about the ICE situation, what's happening in Minnesota and across the country. So Pennsylvania, to your point, is not a sanctuary state, but Philadelphia is a sanctuary city. How do you address some of the strident, some people even say dangerous rhetoric coming from people within your own party in the state? In particular, Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner, who said this in front of Philadelphia City Hall.
This is a small bunch of wannabe Nazis. That's what they are. In a country of 350 million, we outnumber them. If we have to hunt you down the way they hunted down Nazis for decades, we will find your identities, we will find you, we will achieve justice.
It makes some people really uncomfortable. They look at that and say an elected official is dehumanizing law enforcement and could lead to someone getting really hurt. What's your take on that?
That kind of rhetoric is unacceptable, it is abhorrent, and it is wrong. Period. Hard stop. End of sentence.
So Josh Shapiro is someone who does not like at all the fact that Larry Krasner, who is a reformist DA, dares compare ICE to Nazis. Josh Shapiro is someone who does not like hyperbolic comparisons at all. Listen to something he had to say about student protesters who were in support of Palestine.
We have to query whether or not we would tolerate this if this were people dressed up in KKK outfits or KKK regalia making comments about people who are African American in our communities.
So just to clarify, Josh Shapiro is not okay with comparing ICE to Nazis, but he's A-okay with comparing non-violent, unarmed protesters who don't want to see Palestinian children killed to the KKK. Totally fair, very consistent moral standards. Let's take a look at another person who is very bothered by the comparisons between ICE and the Nazis. Trigger warning, once again, this is going to be Batya Ungar Sargon reacting to the comparisons that she's very upset about.
Another week, another slew of Democrats calling ICE, Donald Trump, and his advisor, Stephen Miller, Nazis.
Many of us grew up reading that story of Anne Frank. Somebody's going to write that children's story about Minnesota.
Stephen Miller, who basically is a copycat of the Nazis.
Do not compare ICE or Border Patrol agents to the Nazis. That's an unfair comparison. The Nazis were willing to show their faces.
Did you catch that? ICE is actually worse than the Nazis. You got to hand it to the Nazis, says Stephen Colbert. At least they didn't wear masks. As someone who half my family was murdered by the actual Nazis, let me explain why this is so offensive.
Instead of listening to you, Batya, I too lost family members to the Holocaust, but you know who has a little bit more cred on this issue? I would have to say would be René Lichtman, someone who lost his own father and many other relatives during the Holocaust, and yet somehow he sees that it's appropriate to compare ICE to Nazis. As you can see from this poster he made, which says ICE equals swastika and has a photo of children in a concentration camp. And again, this is someone who was in hiding during the Holocaust, whose father was killed fighting Nazis, and whose family in Poland was wiped out. So it's rich to me to see Batya Ungar Sargon, someone who has never faced any real anti-Semitism. Somehow she is offended by an analogy that this Holocaust survivor himself made. But let's take a listen to Rene Lichtman.
I'm a child survivor of the Holocaust. I was about 2 years old when the war began, and I went into hiding. My family members were picked up in the streets of Paris in the very same way that ICE people are deputizing local police and picking them up in the streets. This is a photograph of the French police deputized by the Nazis picking up Jewish men. And they got the list of the men to be picked up by the French police, who kept lists of the Jews in Paris, including Jewish children, including children on my street who were picked up and went to the gas chambers, while I was fortunate to be in hiding. I see a lot of parallels, Mr. Chairman. I see a lot of parallels to what is going on right now in cities like Ann Arbor and Pontiac, where ICE is coming in and with the help of the local police are picking up immigrants. Two very quick points. These are photographs of my two relatives. This young woman, by the way, who happened to be blonde hair, blue eyes, so in terms of profiling, she could pass, but she was picked up and she went to the gas chambers as well. Another, I just want to say also that today, I think people should know that, today is the day that 1,000 Jews were prevented from coming to the shores of the United States on the SS St. Louis. If you look it up, if you Google, the SS St. Louis today is a day where 1,000 Jews were sent back, and half of them went to their gas chambers, went to their deaths. That's the SS St. Louis. It was prevented by people in the State Department from coming into the United States. Also, results of what's going on right now, I want to show you a small article from the Jewish press in Detroit, where, and I speak at the Holocaust Center quite a bit because I'm a survivor, and we have education where we teach tolerance and diversity and against stereotyping, etc. We teach that to children, young people, adults all over the state of Michigan who come to the Holocaust Center for education. Windsor, Ontario, has sent us a letter saying that they no longer will be sending buses of children to the Holocaust Center because they're concerned that a lot of the children may be questioned about their status. This is in the Jewish News. You can look it up. I just want to add very quickly that I went into the United States Army, and I was in an intelligence unit, and my immediate officer was a captain, a young West Point captain. One day he called me in, he said, "Lichtman, we've got your name here on a list of aliens." He says, "What are you doing working in an intelligence unit in the Army, in the U.S.?" I said, "Well, sir, I don't know. You know, I came here. I assumed that I became a citizen automatically when my mother married an American a citizen." He said, "Well, that ain't the case, so get your butt into town and go in front of Judge so-and-so and so-and-so." Today, I would probably ICE could have been called on me, and I would have been shipped off. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate it very much.
That was the wonderful Rene Lichtman, and we are so lucky that we met him. We are going to play a clip of Rashida Tlaib, who honored him when he passed away.
Honor the life and legacy of my dear friend Rene Lichtman, a Holocaust survivor and activist in our community who deeply was committed to justice in southeastern Michigan and around the world. He was my adopted uncle. Rene passed away at 87 years old, dedicated his life to teaching others about the Holocaust, ensuring that stories of survivors would never be forgotten. He worked so hard to live by the mission of never again to anyone. Through his art, film, and photography, he captured the resilience of the human spirit, and through his activism, he fought for social justice and an end to human suffering. At the age of 63, Rene got his PhD in instructional technology and spent 2 decades working at a hospital in our community. Even in the end of his life, Rene was painting, organizing with Jewish Voices for Peace in Detroit, and standing up for Palestinian human rights. His impact and legacy will live through his work and the countless lives he touched. May his memory and work live forever. I will miss you, Rene. I love you.
And I'm just going to read a little bit about Rene, and then we're going to play another excerpt of an interview with him where he compares Nazis to Israelis, which is something that's very painful for him, he said, to realize, but it was something he did indeed realize. René Lichtman passed away at 87 years old in the Detroit area, which he called home for over 50 years. René was born in 1937 in Paris, France, to parents Helen and Jacob Zajman. He immigrated to the U.S. with his mother in 1950 when he was 12 years old. Surviving family members include his wife of 54 years, Kathy, and his children Joshua, David, and Risa, and Maceo Bishop, as well as grandchildren Emzy, Laser, Benjamin, and Lou, and other loving family and friends. And again, we're so happy that we were able to meet him. There we are with Brad and Rene, who is just so hilarious too. And he says such funny things. I'm really excited about this documentary that we're working on. Just so you know, he was basically fired as a lecturer at this Holocaust museum because they refused to talk about the Gaza genocide. So what he did after they refused to talk about it is he would protest across the street. They would do a vigil across the street, and he co-founded something called the Coalition Against Genocide, which continues to meet. So again, there you have it, that his activism is still with us, even though he's not. So here is the interview.
You have these people that are pretty openly fascist, I would say. They're called extremists or white supremacists or whatever they are. But their action, their behavior, as you can see, to me, it's such a shock what's going on in Gaza, what has gone on in the name of the Jewish people. It's beyond belief. And as someone who's been a speaker in the Holocaust Center here, and also in the general community, I've been invited to speak in schools a lot. And I always talk about at the end, you talk about the lessons of the Holocaust and you try to paint a kind of more positive picture as to the lessons. You talk about, lessons have taught me against stereotype, against intolerance, accepting diversity, things like that. Well,
and never again.
And never again to anyone, because that's what I meant. Of course, the right wing would say never again to the Jews. I mean, they're only interested in their issues. The thing about the Jewish community, they are the most oppressed. They're the biggest victims, right? There's a kind of a hierarchy of victimhood in the Jewish community, especially in the Holocaust and the survivor community, who suffered more. So even today, as they're doing these horrible things in Gaza, they see themselves, Israelis, Jews, here in Detroit, they see themselves as victims. And the oppressor is, the typical anti-Semites, or the Nazis, or now they're the Arabs or the Palestinians, and they're not real. The Jewish people have dehumanized Arabs. They've dehumanized in the same way, and I learned this a long time ago, the way that Americans dehumanized the Vietnamese. I remember the period when I was pretty active in the anti-Vietnam movement, where the propaganda that we had here, the media, we dehumanized Vietnamese. They were not human beings, they were gooks. And so for target practice in the military, I remember seeing they would have these images of slant-eyed people, and they were all the enemies. So that gave permission to our U.S. soldiers to kill children because they were, of course, carrying grenades, and justified killing civilians very much exactly the way Jewish troops today, these young kids who know nothing, these soldiers who've been brainwashed, are killing civilians. And this way, this time it's much worse because it's really not one-on-one contact where you're looking at the eyes of the civilian you're going to kill. This time it's from the air, right? A lot of it is just these long-distance murder of civilians and children. And the alibi is, well, they're using them as human shields, which is it's just lies. And I learned that years ago, little by little, as these various operations by the Israelis against Palestinians have occurred, that there were all these excuses that the Israeli military had. They were using civilians as human shields. And I remember, again, the terrorists were doing that. And I remember saying, it's really strange. There were all these children who've been killed, who've been used as human shields. But so who, if you've killed the terrorists, where are these terrorists? All these terrorists that have been killed, you never see who they are, really, because a lot of them are just civilians. But those are the excuses that the Jewish people and the media, especially the media in Israel and the media in the United States, put forward. So Jews do not see Arabs or Palestinians especially as we've dehumanized them. And I see it as genocide. I see it as equivalent. It's difficult for me to say that, but it's equivalent to what happened in the Holocaust. Now, you could say the numbers are different. You can get into all these distractions, etc. But in terms of what it's doing and what it's done to first the Holocaust, I could never, as a speaker, I'm sure these speakers like myself, they're being asked at the end of their talk at a Holocaust museum or in school, well, you've suffered so much. How do you explain what you've done in Gaza? How do you explain that? All these civilians who've been killed, all these children, and I'm supposed to represent children. I talk a lot about children because 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered by the Germans. And how did they do that? One way it was explained by Himmler, one of the Nazis, why these Germans were killing civilians and children, because these German soldiers were having PTSD in those days. They were killing civilians. And we know they were having those issues, emotional issues, because they wrote home letters to their family about that. And they complained to their officers that they were killing civilians and they didn't sign up for that. And to the degree where Himmler, second in command in the Nazis, went out in 43 and 44 to the Eastern Front and gave them pep talk. And he said to them, if it's very difficult for you Germans to be killing civilians. We know that because you're such a caring people. But you have to kill these children, because if you don't, they will grow up and be avengers. And that's the terminology he used, avengers. They will seek revenge on you for what you did to their family members. And that's what the Israelis are doing and saying and thinking when they kill Palestinians. It's preventive murder. If we don't kill them now, they will grow up and become avengers. And so, but what it's doing in practice, of course, it's creating recruits for the what I call the Palestinian resistance. And I've talked about this where I see the resistance, Hamas, as equivalent to the Jewish ghetto uprising. I see them as resistance, as maybe not freedom fighters the way they were in Vietnam, but in the ghetto, in the Jewish ghetto, the young people, and they were always left-wing socialists or communists who organized this resistance, and their thinking was, we're going to be murdered, we're going to die, and we want to take some of them with us, which they did. They killed quite a few Germans. And Norman Finkelstein talks about that these young people in Gaza, which is an open-air concentration camp, and he's not the only one that said that. A lot of political people have said that long before him, that Gaza is an open-air concentration camp. You can't get in, you can't get out. These people are born there. They're the second generation from the Nakba, where they were kicked out of Israel. They went to Gaza. They were born there. They lived there. They're going to die there. And with that mentality, I could see where young people joining resistance, and the resistance would be Hamas. And the Nakba, I would say, by the way, it's not like it happened once. It's been, I'm not the only one saying that. Analysts have said that as well. It's continued until today. The Nakba has really, that the Israelis have always have continued to try to kick out the Palestinians. The Nakba was when about 800,000 Palestinians were, during the War of Independence, all these Palestinians left, either from their own accord or they were, there was terrorism against them, their villages, etc. They left thinking they could come back. But of course, once they left, the Israelis, the Zionists, realized we're not going to let them back in. And that kind of mentality still continues. So in the West Bank, you have the settlements, and where they're still trying to kick out Palestinians, and they want to do the same thing with Gaza. So they have this, the whole land being free of Palestinians. We have to recognize, in terms of the Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby, in terms of its influence on the U.S., especially the Congress, and politicians paying them off all these years and helping to brainwash Jewish children. A lot of them, Jewish children, who at some point realized when they went to Israel on these trips, well, wait a minute, there's all these other people there. Now, fortunately, I was given a tour by friends of mine in Jerusalem of the West Bank. And these friends of mine that were still there in Israel, in Jerusalem, they're part of these kind of human rights groups where they sit and they observe the border so that these soldiers don't humiliate. Humiliation is a big part. And the Israeli military learned that from the Nazis as well. The Nazis, the first step the Nazis were going to do was humiliate the Jews by cutting off their beards or making fun of them, etc., etc. And the Israelis do the same thing to the Arabs. And so, and they do that, for example, at the border. These young soldiers with these guns humiliate Palestinians at the border who are coming into work, etc. So these friends of mine are at the border, making sure that doesn't go on, And so these friends took me to the West Bank. I saw the conditions, not completely, but I was very aware of the two worlds. That's apartheid. Apartheid. I remember recently, well, you couldn't use a word like that. You couldn't use genocide, etc. But the last 3 or 4 months, we've learned that no, it applies. People now use the word genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, all these terms that are part of our vocabulary, because even the main media in the United States has been forced to recognize that. And so I little by little, I realized but I was always hoping for a two-state solution, and I still do, and I think it's still possible. People can get along if you don't have these people, whipping up hatred. And today you've got the extreme right wing in Israel who want to, Bibi is considered a centrist, believe it or not, Netanyahu, compared to these, yeah.
What is the connection between Never Again and what is happening now in Gaza? And why is it that more people don't make the connection between what happened to the Jews and the Holocaust and what's happening to Palestinians today? Why do you think you're able to see that, but so many people aren't?
Well, the media has a lot to do with it. The Jewish leadership, just think of it. We got rabbis all over the world. Now, do the rabbis ever talk about that? And what kind of language do they use? No. And I know this from personally because I've been through, a bunch of synagogues over my lifetime with my kids until today, where there was a very, very liberal congregation where, I thought the rabbi was very liberal, and then it turned out to, at one point there were these calls for "We stand for Israel" during what Hamas did, right? So what Hamas did was, boy, was seized upon by the right-wing leadership in this country, in the United States, as these are savages. It was used to paint the Palestinians as savages. This is language that they use, animals. They cut off the breast of women. They killed children. They rape women. All of these lies, they've been shown to be lies, but they've hid the media, and American media, which is sold, bought off by the corporation. It's called the corporate media for a reason. It's bought off, and a lot of it by the AIPAC crowd. ADL is part of the Jewish lobby and all of these other billionaires. And so a lot of the population in the United States is completely ignorant, especially the Jewish community, the Jewish newspapers. You know, I read some of that press, but the rabbis notice they never, there's a few voices that speak up and talk about Jewish values. Now, I have to say, Jewish values are the ones that influenced me in my, so-called left wing, but also, other voices, Catholic Worker, Dorothy Day, people like that, those Christian social revolutionaries and stuff like that. So the rabbis don't say anything. And if you do say something, whether it's, Cornel West or Chris, some of these other voices, Chris Hedges, Norm Finkelstein, you get destroyed. You get destroyed in terms of your career, your job, your family. You can't do anything. I call it Jewish McCarthyism. If you know anything about McCarthyism, and I knew people who were the subjects of McCarthyism, who were blacklisted, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew people with, John Garfield and that family in New York, and others, Zero Mostel, and so that had a big influence. So I consider this Jewish McCarthyism, where you speak up, and in my case, I can say that because of my age and the fact that I'm retired, and so I don't care anymore. But when my last rabbi stood up and he said, "I stand for Israel," I just got so, which is very recent. Before that, he was standing up for Rashida Tlaib. Suddenly, he changed his tune.
Wow.
I stand for Israel. When all the rabbis were being pressured in Detroit to stand up for Israel, that's it. That was the litmus test. If you didn't, you're going to catch hell. That means your congregation, the people that give money to your, it's a money issue. It's your fundraisers locally. They would leave. Your congregation would splinter. I experienced that when Trump was elected. I belonged to a conservative synagogue at that time, and I realized that half of my friends who were socially progressive on the question of Palestine, they weren't so progressive.
Yeah, there's a term for that. It's called PEP, Progressive Except on Palestine.
Exactly, progressive except on Palestine. And when I realized that these friends were, pretty right-wing and pro-Trump and pro-Israel, I left that congregation because I realized that the rabbi would never say, in the next year or 4 years, would never say anything hostile to the present government. So, it leaves you kind of alone. But, that's the price. There's been other people, my role models, again, I feel like part of the, there's an international community of people that believe in social justice. And I was starting to talk about where my values come from. They come from learning about the Old Testament, about the Jewish tradition. I always learn about, you care for the justice, you shall see.
Tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam. And you care about the widow and the orphan and the homeless. Those are the values that I believe in. Now, those are not the values of the right wing in Israel. As a matter of fact, the right wing, and there are some rabbis who've written about that, who are very right wing, and they say all this tikkun olam is baloney. They believe that the Jews belong on this land and nobody else does. And, we're the most oppressed. And therefore, because of the Holocaust, we've been so oppressed that we can do anything and the world will not criticize us. So that when you think of European countries, they have such guilt still, including the Germans, about what they did, that they will not say a word against the Israeli leadership.
Right. And they make Palestinians, though, pay for their crimes. The Germans do.
Exactly. Yes, they're able to, kind of transfer that guilt. I think the issue today. I remember there was a period a couple of years ago where in Europe, suddenly the Jewish community was not being attacked as a scapegoat for various issues, but it was the immigrants, these Muslim Arab immigrants that were the enemy, and that's still the situation. The enemy, in Europe is the foreigner, and that means the dark-skinned people, Africans, North Africans, etc. And so things have changed in Europe, but that's anti-foreign sentiment and right-wing equivalent. Israel right-wingers have allies in France and Italy, where they're also right-wing, also fascistic in terms of their views.
And that was the wonderful René Lichtman, and we miss him so much. And we send our love and condolences to his family, and his memory and his activism lives on through his words. And we are so excited to be bringing this documentary, which will feature him in it, and just so grateful that we met him.